Let's be honest with ourselves. Most of us are doing accessory exercises for one of two reasons. We're either trying to get as jacked as humanly possible, or because our coach told us to. And it's some kind of fluff accessory that we're doing for stability or whatever reason, and half the time we're skipping it. So today we're starting a new series. It's called 3 Underrated Accessories for Powerlifters, and today is episode 1. And to get right into it, we are going to be targeting the lower body, talking specifically about the front foot elevated split squat, the B stance deadlift, and the seated hamstring curl. Let's get to work. So let's talk about the front foot elevated split squat. Whenever we see split squats make their way into powerlifting programs, they're usually done in the form of Bulgarians or some kind of knees over toes functional fitness style. And when we're talking about Bulgarians, I think coaches everywhere have kind of retired the Bulgarian, knowing primarily that most of their lifters are too soft to actually push them hard. But when we're thinking about hypertrophy movements and why we would opt for something unilateral compared to something bilateral for muscle growth, we would kind of hope that it also provides some kind of movement variability that makes us feel better. And I find a lot of lifters don't actually find Bulgarians to serve that purpose, primarily because they're doing them in this get it up by any means necessary style if they are brave enough to push the movement hard. Which then brings us to this more functional fitness side of split squats, where people mistakenly assume that if I'm just squatting knees over toes, all my hip, knee, and back problems are gonna go away, and it's complementing everything that I'm missing on my actual squat. But this is not actually so. I think one of the benefits of the front foot elevated split squat in particular is that it gives you access to hip flexion and squatting down while being able to keep your center of mass back in space. And the reason that this is important is that when we're squatting, we're constantly shoving our rib cage forward in space. When we're benching, we're constantly creating this upward and forward rib cage rotation. And while that movement by itself is not problematic, if we are stuck in this position, we can lose relative ranges of motion that may cause us to feel stiff or even cause discomfort. And the way I commonly see this manifest on something like a squat is someone feels a lot of compression at the low back above the pelvis, or they maybe even feel pinching in the front of the hip at the bottom of a squat. Let's talk about now how the front foot elevated split squat would solve that. So the front foot elevated split squat, like I said, gives us the opportunity to move through hip flexion with our center of mass back in space. So it helps us keep our pelvis underneath us, it helps us keep our rib cage back over our pelvis, and restore some of that hip flexion that we may have lost over the constant squat and bench press patterns we're doing week to week. So how do we set up the front foot elevated split squat? Well, the first step is box height. We want to make sure that the box height is not so low that our back knee is already hitting the ground before we get to depth, but we also don't want it so high that we can't stand perfectly tall at the start of the rep. The second thing that we want to consider is our shin angle. We don't want this to be a knees over toes movement. We actually would prefer that the squat pattern starts with a slightly negative shin angle with our weight behind us, and by the time we get to the bottom of the squat, the shin angle is only neutral. This is going to give us access to some hip flexion that we haven't had access to on our squat and maybe have felt restriction in getting to. Now, as far as the execution goes, this is going along with the shin angle, which is to say that we don't want our center of mass to shift or migrate forward as we're descending in the squat. We want to treat this like an elevator movement, where our head is over our ribs, which is over our pelvis, and that track is where we move along for the entirety of the squat. So we're trying to keep it very vertical. And then the final piece of information I would give is bracing. Do not brace and create this full body stiffness in the same way that you would on a competition squat. Simply inhale on the way down and exhale on the way up. Now, in terms of loading, this is a movement where I would recommend holding a dumbbell in the contralateral side, or the opposite side of the leg that is forward. And the reason for this is, to put it in simple terms, it's going to help us load that front side hip a little bit better. And what you may find after performing this exercise is that you can get into deeper squats. Maybe you feel some relief in the low back because you're not pushing so much extension, and you may get rid of that hip pinch that you were feeling in the bottom of your competition squat. So the next exercise we are going to talk about is the B stance Romanian deadlift. Now, the reason I love this exercise so much is that there are a shocking number of individuals, even those who have been competing in powerlifting for a long time, who cannot demonstrate a good hinge pattern. Now, obviously, if you're an elite level lifter and you've been healthy for most of your career, I'm not gonna put that much emphasis on your need to address this, but for the vast majority of you, it's holding you back in terms of durability and potentially even technique. Now, one of the ways you may know you need this exercise is that you have difficulty keeping a neutral spine when hinging down in a deadlift. You eventually feel like you run out of space and you just have to squat down or round over your belt so that you're starting with a more rounded back position. And some of the ways this can manifest itself in terms of discomfort is that we may deal with some glute tightness or stiffness below the level of the pelvis, or we get back pain that is sensitive to that low back flexion or rounding. So what this movement will hopefully afford us is more space in that backside, feeling like it's stretching out the back pocket area so that we can access a hinge more easily and then have better deadlift technique and hopefully stay out of pain a little bit longer. So how do we set up the B stance RDL? Well, the first recommendation I'm going to give is to actually use a wall reference. Now, if you look up tutorials of a B stance deadlift or a single leg RDL online, you're probably going to find one of two demonstrations. Either one where it's truly just done on one leg, where the rear leg is floating, and I think this creates too much instability where it doesn't actually achieve what we're trying to do here. And in a B stance, while this is good, may still be too difficult for people who are having trouble really finding that glute and hamstring sensation when hinging. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your back leg, put the heel of it against the wall, and put your toes on the ground right in front of it. And what this will do is it will anchor you against the wall for extra stability. You'll have your pelvis sort of situated underneath you better, and then you can focus purely on that front leg. Now, the second element of your setup that we're going to focus on is actually creating a slight rotation over the front leg. Now, this is not an extreme turn. We're not trying to twist aggressively. What I would just recommend is taking your nose and putting it over your big toe. That will be a sufficient turn to make sure that we are loading the front leg and that we can sit back into it appropriately. Now, what we're going to pair along with that is a weight distribution of maybe 65% over that front leg and 35% over the rear leg. And then from here, it's very simple. We're just going to try to push our butt on the front loaded side back to the wall. So the torso falls, the butt pushes back, and what we should feel is that back pocket area stretching. In terms of loading, we can do this contralaterally like we did with the split squat. Sometimes we can load it with both hands. I would recommend starting contralateral, and if you truly get proficient that you need more weight, go right ahead. But if we can achieve this movement pattern and the sensations that we talked about, this is going to free up a ton of space in the back of the hip and maybe gives us the opportunity to deadlift more efficiently, deadlift more comfortably, and maybe even recover better, because if our lower back is taking less of a beating, we can probably handle more deadlifting, we can probably handle more squatting, and ultimately our training is going to go better. And the third exercise that we are going to talk about is the seated hamstring curl. Now, for hypertrophy of the hamstrings and movement variability, either a seated or lying hamstring curl is a phenomenal option because the hamstrings will not get trained through knee flexion on the squat or the deadlift. But you'll notice I specifically said seated hamstring curl because for the purpose of this video, we are talking about improving ranges of motion and giving ourselves the opportunity to bring our center of mass back in space to do so. Now, one of the things that we often find is that powerlifters lose hip internal rotation over time. And if you've ever tried to do a toe touch and feel restricted, or maybe an active straight leg raise and can't get to 90 degrees, you probably fall into this camp. And one of the great things about the seated hamstring curl is it's going to put you in that position and allow you to train the hamstrings through it and reorient the pelvis and rib cage. So as far as execution goes, what we're going to want to do is set up the seated hamstring curl so that we're in that sort of straight leg raise position with our legs out in front of us, right? And we're going to feel that stretch on the hamstrings. And what we do from here then is we are going to lean forward, but then push our rib cage back. So it lets us lean over the machine, feel that length in the hamstrings, but then bring our ribs back and hold that position with our abs and obliques. And as we are reached forward, then we are going to go through the reps where we exhale on the curl, inhale on the way up. And what this will do is it'll improve our range of motion in hip flexion and internal rotation, not simply by just lengthening our hamstrings, right? It's not the case that we're always tight in our hamstrings, but it could be the case that we haven't had the hip flexion and internal rotation capabilities that the seated hamstring curl is now allowing us to train through. And one of the ways that you'll be able to tell that this is improved is you'll feel like you can hinge better and toe touch better. So in programming these movements, I think they can go in one of three training slots. The first one is in movement prep, where you're not actually taking these movements near failure and treating them like true bodybuilding movements, but you're just doing them to open up some range of motion and hopefully give yourself the opportunity to squat, deadlift, or maybe arch on the bench press a little more freely. The second slot where they may be beneficial is simply after your heavy movements, because if you've now done a heavy primary squat or deadlift, you're probably going to be inclined toward the positions that you put yourself into, and loosening some of that up afterward maybe will help you feel a little bit less stiff in the hours or days following those heavy sessions. And then the final slot these can go in is maybe in the 24 to 48 hours before your biggest session. And in terms of loading strategies, I would say this would fit neatly in between the two that I've previously mentioned, meaning that if it were done as movement prep, we would probably do it the lightest. If it were done after our primary lift, we would probably do it the heaviest. And then if we were to do it in the days before to hopefully free up some space, we would take it a little bit heavier than a movement prep, but not so heavy that we generated a ton of training fatigue and muscular soreness. So that's all I have for you guys in today's video. If you are tired of the guesswork and want something that is structured at an affordable rate, head on over to Strength Now. Strength Now is our template-based programming service. We have 4 custom programs made by elite coaches in the sport, targeting all different experience levels and styles of lifting. It comes with a full exercise library, data tracking sheet, and access to a Discord community to ask questions and post your lifts. It is only $50, and I think this is the best investment you can make for your training if you don't currently work with a coach and do not have plans on hiring one. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will be coming out with episodes of this on an alternating basis with the topical videos. As always, my name is Sean Noriega, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.